we're happy that you're here, and it's wonderful to be able to invite two people from my hometown to do a presentation. We've got Valerie Tiley and Lenora Nardelli. They are called school intervention specialists, and they're at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is a great hospital. This is part of the hospital's holistic focus on taking care of the whole child. So what they do is they both have master's degree in education, they're colleagues, and they'll discuss the types of support and plans that parents should have to creatively collaborate with the school, especially when there are issues or barriers of taking care of their child, or if there are roadblocks to getting something accomplished. And part of their focus is on how you can have a good relationship with the school and do all of those things. So without further ado, I want to introduce Valerie and Lenora to take it from here. The presentation is a little bit longer than what your schedule says. It's supposed to be 45 minutes, and I think it goes about 54 minutes. So what they're going to do is go to the lounge afterward and answer any questions you may have. So just go into the lounge right after. You'll have a few minutes if you have any burning questions. So with that, then I'm going to disappear into the background and turn.
Hi, thank you for joining us for A Path to Success, Advocating for Your Child at School. I'm Lenora Nardelli, and I'm co-presenting here today with Valerie Tiley, and we are school liaison specialists from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I'm going to turn it over to Valerie to give us some of our learning objectives for the day.
Hi, so we're glad you're joining us virtually today, and maybe one day we will get to meet you in person, and we wish we could be in person presenting this information. But for today, we're hoping by the end of this, you will be able to recognize educational implications for your child, as well as potential supports, understand what's needed in your child's education plan, and be able to navigate any barriers that may arise when advocating for your child. We recognize that you are all in different parts of your child's educational journey. We know that some of you are, every child is different with their needs, as well as the age of your child, the location of where you live. This is obviously an international, I believe, presentation. So we know there could be people even from different countries here, and all those different systems. Everyone is going to have different needs. So we are hoping that everyone will get something out of this. And we also recognize that some of you are going to be brand new and need some foundation to your child's education. And some of you are going to be so well versed and so experienced that you could probably give this presentation. And we hope that those of you will stay on as well, and so that we have questions at the end, we can help answer some of those and hear kind of where you are with your child's education. And as we prepared for this, I did realize that looking back in my own teaching career, I actually did teach a child with one of these brain disorders. So it's kind of full circle for me to be able to come and speak to you all today. I'm going to pass it back off to Lenora.
Okay, so first we want to talk about the different ways your child may be impacted at school by their disorder. We often refer to these as educational implications, and we have them broken down by physical, emotional, and cognitive. And, we know again that this brain disorder can be quite a spectrum, and you may be experiencing different types of implications with your child at different points in their schooling. So we want to just cover each of these and then also provide some recommendations to go along with each of these implications. So I'm going to have Valerie go ahead and start with the physical implications.
Okay, so let's look at some of these physical or medical implications. Again, we're not medical experts, and certainly not medical experts in this disorder, but we've examined some of the most common symptoms we see. It might be a good idea for you to break these down for your school this way as well, to make sure you're addressing all of your child's physical issues. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and some of these may or may not apply to your child, but We have here listed speech, including articulation concerns, impaired gait, fine motor deficits, vision deficits, balance and coordination issues, bowel or bladder incontinence, seizures, as well as pain. And these really can affect the child in the classroom in multiple ways. So for some of these, we're going to take a look at some different supports. And again, you know your child best, and you may already have some of these thoughts already be maybe advocating for some of these, but if not, we wanted to just review a few. So the first, we've got plans. You want to plan ahead, plan some more. So especially when it comes to these physical issues, you want to look at emergency plans. Any kind of emergency evacuation or emergency seizure plan or an emergency fall plan. Lenora will briefly touch later on individual health plans, but this is where you definitely want to make sure your child has a health plan at school. You also want to think about plans for supervision for your child. So do they need supervision during unstructured times? Younger kids with recess, at lunchtime, in the restroom, do they need that one-on-one supervision? Do they need some kind of modified schedule? Could be a hybrid of home instruction, online instruction, in person. Really have to be creative, and you don't have to necessarily pick one and stick with it. It can be a blend. And then think about restroom plans too. Is your child a kid that needs to be, is your child in diapers? Do they need to be changed? Do they need to use the restroom? Do you need handicap stalls? Those kinds of things. And then we also want to think about accommodations, which are generally tools that allow your child to access the curriculum. So does your child need different kind of seating? Your child may be in a wheelchair to move around the building, maybe using a walker, but maybe they can sit in the classroom. Maybe they can sit on the floor. Do they need a cube chair? Do they need specialized, or modified desk? Think about when kids are younger, they may be on the carpet in the classroom. So you want to think about seating for that to make sure kids are included. If your child's a little bit older, think about all the different environments in the school building, including art and music, where seating may be a little bit different or look a little different. Your child may need increased verbal and visual cues. Visual cues are especially important. So having those either picture cards or words to remind your child, to give reminders throughout the day for different things. Breaks, and those could be for stretching. Those could be for a chance to get up and move. They could be for sensory issues. Enlarged print, other kinds of print or vision type of accommodations as well, like different, backgrounds on paper, different colors, using different types of, not different types, but looking at how to kind of clean up a paper so that there's not as much on it to see. It's not as cluttered looking. And adaptive or assistive technology, you definitely want to be exploring that with your school. Schools, as well as most hospitals, can provide evaluations, whether that be for more physical assistive technology, and I've got wheelchairs and standers listed on here, as well as adaptive technology for things like speech, for writing, those pieces as well. And then maybe your child needs a sensory diet. Maybe they need, I mentioned those breaks, but maybe they need a chance to get different kind of sensory input into their bodies as well. And the last piece here are services. And these are really people that can help you kind of figure out what's best for your child in terms of accommodations and support at school in the physical realm. So physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists. Districts also should have somebody they can connect with, a teacher, the visually impaired, to help with those visual accommodations, and then specialized transportation as well, getting your child to and from school. Now we're going to switch gears here a little bit and hand it off to Lenora. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're not. Just kidding. And we also recognize that there are limited resources for some school districts. Again, we know you're in different systems across the entire country. So some of you may be in a more rural setting, maybe a poor suburban area. It really, I know, will vary depending on where you are. And so some of these recommendations we just made, you may think school can't do, or school may have told you they can't do. So you may have to think a little creatively here. And the first is a one-on-one aid. So a lot of times kids need these for safety reasons. Maybe school tells you they don't have the personnel to do that. So one strategy would be to break up your child's day into smaller sections, and then you're only covering certain sections at a time. You could certainly utilize volunteers. You could utilize older students, peer buddies, depending on what the need is there. You could look at using a substitute teacher. You could look at using an aide who's already in the classroom and kind of transition their role or responsibility to more working with your child. You also may have a district that has a limited number of therapists or nurses. The school may say, we don't have any visually impaired teachers for visually impaired students. We don't really have a physical therapist. Then they could certainly contract with somebody, local agencies, local hospitals as well. So again, be creative thinking that way. Specialized transportation. We may have sometimes people will live in maybe a cul-de-sac or an apartment building where it's difficult to turn that bus around to pick up a child for school. So again, thinking about vans, different kinds of, not the traditional large school bus that you may think of, or even a traditional smaller special bus that schools will often utilize for these students with these kinds of needs. And then limited space can be an issue. So if your child needs breaks, if they need a chance to lay down and rest, to be stretched, if they need a place to be changed, that may be difficult. So think through the whole building and look at conference rooms, a classroom that's not used most days. Maybe the schedule needs to be different certain days or certain times. But again, think through the school and think about every possible location to utilize for that. And then we also sometimes have issues with older buildings with a lack of accessibility. So if your school does not have an elevator, but they have more than one floor, some things I've actually seen done is moving a whole classroom down to the first floor. I've seen this done where I taught for a student who was using a walker. If your child is going to go up to another level, of course, and there's an elevator, you still need to think through some emergency plans. I've had situations where a child is in a wheelchair and the cafeteria has stairs to get to. So ask the school about maybe doing some kind of motorized lift to get your child down those stairs. If they still cannot access something like the cafeteria, then if you want your child to be included with peers, think about having lunch in a different room with a few peers that could then eat with them on certain days of the week. Could be some kind of rotation that the teacher provides. All of those to provide that sense of normalcy. I've also seen another where it was a young child in a wheelchair and the school didn't have a handicap sink or wheelchair accessible sink. So they actually bought a standalone sink. Basically, I think some of those play sinks actually have real water. And so the child uses that so they can wash their hands as well. So just all of those kinds of things, those limited resources can be helpful in trying to think through. In different kinds of situations. So, and now I will hand it back off to Lenora.
Okay, so next we have the social emotional piece, and sometimes this can be the part of the plan that's forgotten. We're focused, on those physical and cognitive pieces to a child's plan, but we really want to draw attention to the social and emotional piece because it can be really important to your child's success and allowing them to reach their fullest potential at school. So, we have things like social skills deficits and mood personality changes and that loss of normalcy piece. And so in order to address those, some accommodations and thoughts that we have on that, things like regularly scheduled check-ins. So for your child to have these planned breaks with this person that they feel comfortable with. A safe place to go to utilize coping skills. So if your child becomes frustrated in situations or just have these really big emotions, that it would be better for them to go to another place to address that in the IEP planning and make sure that there's a plan for that, where that child will go if this occurs. Also just making sure that you're planning ahead for those, as Valerie mentioned early about sensory breaks, a sensory diet. That's always good to implement and have a plan early on so that hopefully we can mitigate the fact that the child will have to go to another area because of frustration and feeling overwhelming. The monitoring of these concerns, it's always good to set up some kind of communication with your child's school in advance so that you can continue to know how often are they having to go to these different locations for their coping skills, or how much are they becoming frustrated in certain situations. Always good to just have a pulse on how that's going, so that you can interject or intervene when it's appropriate. There's a lot of people in your school that can also help support. So a school counselor, psychologist, or speech therapist. Speech therapists can be really good at working on some coping skills and social skills with your child. So always to check in with those resources. You have your occupational therapists that are really good with emotional regulation and mental health type therapies. And all of these can really be built into your child's IEP. So there can be specific goals surrounding this. So again, as you're thinking about and planning for this in the IEP process, to bring this up to the team that this might be a concern. Other ideas that we had here were mentors or peer tutors or buddies to help with that normalcy piece. So if there is a peer buddy that can maybe sit with your child at lunch to promote some social skill building. And then in some schools, there are school-based therapists that can also be utilized. So always to check and see what resources are available. Additional ideas to think about and can also be addressed in the IEP are involvement in extracurricular activities. So how will that look? What is the plan for that? We also like to mention that Valerie and I, in our roles, we a lot of times will do peer education of a child's disease. And this really helps promote understanding by your child's peers and help reduce any misconceptions that the kids might have regarding your child's diagnosis. So if you are connected with a pediatric hospital, or even any of your other resources that you're connected to see if someone could produce or provide peer education about your child's disease. And so, all of these things, again, are just important to think about and to implement if it's appropriate. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Valerie for cognitive.
So what we think of commonly when we think of school really are cognitive implications. These are most commonly associated with IEPs and sometimes with 504 plans. So in these next couple of slides, we're going to talk about, well, not in these couple slides, excuse me. Later on, we're going to talk a little bit about those plans specifically. But in these next couple of slides, we'll talk about some of these issues here and some supports at school. So sometimes it's as simple as missed instruction. Your child has a lot of appointments. They're in and out. They have absences for medical issues. They, of course, are going to miss out on some of their education that way. There could be attention concerns, learning difficulties, expressive language deficits, as well as executive functioning deficits. And executive functioning are, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the CEO of the brain, but that part of the brain that helps with prioritizing, making decisions, organizing. So a lot of times we'll see kids with any kind of brain disorder have issues with that. So these supports are going to be very, very specific to your child's needs. So when school evaluates your child and sees what those needs are, then they should be zeroing on what it is specifically that your child would have put in place. But a few of these things, one would be modified curriculum. So if your child is learning at a different rate than the rest of the kids, they want to modify. School may differentiate instruction. And you'll see this a lot when kids are included in a general education classroom. It's the same topic, but the standards or maybe the specific problems or questions might look different. So we see this a lot in math. Maybe all the kids are learning how to do word problems, but one child may be doing simple single digit addition and other kids may be doing more complicated word problems. Or maybe everyone's learning about electricity, but the questions they have to answer and what they actually have to take from the lesson maybe look a little different. And there's also compensatory home instruction. You can think of this kind of like makeup lessons, but if your child is missing services at school because of their illness, then you can look at making up time. Sometimes you also hear it called retroactive home instruction. So that would be where you work out one-on-one with the school of how your child will get some of the services. Even if they're back in school, they could still get supplemental services. There's also extended school year. And what that is, really any child that shows regression after an extended break. Generally, a lot of times we'll see that over the summer, and doesn't recoup that regression in a normal amount of time. Schools will usually look at about 6 weeks. Then the child may qualify for extended school year. We also will see this where a child may be just starting to learn a new skill and hasn't quite gotten it yet. And if they take that break, then they're going to lose everything they've learned. And so sometimes schools will offer extended school year for that as well. This is only with kids on an IEP. And again, it will vary a lot depending on how your district interprets what extended school year really is in place for, but that's definitely something to examine if your child you think would fit or criteria for extended school year. And the last is to consider appropriate placement, not one size fits all. So you don't have to put your child purely in a resource room all day long, or only in general education classroom, or only in a multiple disabilities classroom. There can be a little bit of play with, they go here for a little bit, here for a little bit, whatever is appropriate for your child. And then some accommodations and other strategies that you could look into would be, number one is minimizing distractions. So again, we talked about visually having papers that are very clean with very little, print on them, a clean workspace, having minimal auditory distractions as well. So maybe working in a quiet room, modifying tests. And there's a couple other strategies that we have seen used. One is errorless learning. And it's really just a simple way of, sometimes I think about like file folder games, things where really there's only one possible answer, so to speak, so the child is not going to get it wrong. And by continuing to have that repetitive work, then a child will hopefully pick up a concept that way. Backward chaining would be, usually it's used when they're step-by-step. So for instance, making a bed, and your child may do the very last step. And then we'll add on to that as they start learning the process. Maybe they only put the pillows in the bed the first few times. Then the child learns to pull up the bedspread and put the pillows in the bed. Then the child learns to put the sheets, bedspread, pillow. So you just keep adding on as they're able to do that. And then real world teaching, meaning just connecting to the real world as much as possible, using, when a child learns money, use real coins, not paper coins, not plastic coins, not pictures of coins, but actual coins. And then just relating things to the real world as much as possible, making things as authentic as possible. Again, visual and verbal cues can be very helpful. Using technology, organizational tools like color coding things to help kids. And then if your child is, again, we know this is quite a spectrum of disorders. So if your child is in more of an academic setting, making sure they're getting extended time and small group testing. There are things like word banks, graphic organizers, study guides, copies of notes, all of those can be accommodations as well. And then we also have listed additional personnel supports. And this is really, we're thinking again about that one-on-one aid. But generally speaking, schools are going to be hesitant to put a one-on-one aid in place for academic purposes. You're much more likely to get a one-on-one aid for physical issues or safety, again, like we mentioned earlier. Sometimes kids may have access to an aid in the classroom to help them, not necessarily one-on-one. What you'll hear schools say sometimes is they'll use a phrase called learned helplessness. So sometimes if one person is attached to a child all day long at school, that child begins to look to them to do things for them. And they will sit kind of helplessly and just wait. So if your child does have a one-on-one aid, you're definitely going to want to make sure that they are not doing for your child until your child needs the help, and trying to help promote some independence. So we're going to go here, what we're calling a rest stop. If we were in person, we probably would have liked to have stopped here to allow you to ask questions based on the information we just gave. But take a moment to jot down any barriers you've seen for your child at school. If there were any new ideas, maybe what we said wasn't something specific we said, but it triggered another idea for you. Maybe you have some questions based on what we said. Maybe you haven't thought about different members of the school or the district who might be a good person to be on your child's team. So take just a moment to jot some of those ideas down. We'll pause just for a moment here before we continue on with the next section.
Okay, so now we're going to bring our attention to the educational plans. And we have them set up here in this triangle where we have our individual plan, individual health plan at the bottom. I'm not going to go into great detail of this because I want, for the sake of time, to really dig deeper into the IEP, the individual education plan. But I do want to make a few comments about this. This is something that can be quickly implemented, and if your doctor has a diagnosis letter or some information about their diagnosis, we would be able to provide that to the nurse and be able to do a quicker implementation of this type of plan. And so it would, again, address the medical, physical needs. Then above that, we have the 504 plan, and a few comments about the 504 plan. This is the accommodation plan. So really thinking about, does your child have a disability that affects their major life functions? And this can be a mental or a physical disability and impacts them in a significant way. However, we really want to look deeper into the IEP because in many cases that might be the more appropriate route for your child. But a 504 plan is an option, and it does go beyond high school and can be implemented into a college or a work environment if that's the need. So then that brings us to the top of the individual education plan, and we'll go into much more detail, as I said, in the coming slides. Off to the side, though, we do have this little marking of non-public school plans. And this is really important if your child is not in a typical public school system, that each of these operate a little bit differently. So the best advice we have is to talk to the administrator at that school system to see what they are able to offer for your child. And we will, again, explore some of these non-public school options a little bit later on. This next slide we like to refer to as our alphabet soup. So as you're in these meetings and as you're in the school setting and talking to educators, you'll hear a lot of these acronyms being thrown around. And so we just wanted to draw attention to a few of these, and we recognize that there's a lot more to this list, but a few that are that come up quite often. Some of them are more closely tied to the federal guidelines. So you'll hear IDEA quite frequently in the IEP process, and things like FERPA, the Family Education Rights Act. Those are very common that you'll hear. Some less common that sometimes I'll find families are not quite as aware of are things like FBA. This is a functional behavior assessment and really is needed in order to implement something called a BIP, or a behavior intervention plan. So if that's needed for your child, those might be some words or terminology that the school will introduce you to. Another one down the list a little bit is the individual family service plan. And this is really geared towards children under the age of 3, so prior to being in the school system and being introduced to an IEP. So some of you may fall into that category and know a little bit about information on that. So let's talk more specifically about those education plans. And because they are so individualized, those of you that have been through this process probably know by now, it's a pretty lengthy process. You know, you have to start with really looking at the evaluation and giving the school time to figure out what your child's needs are, and then figuring out, based on those needs and based on the evaluation, what it is that needs to be implemented in order to help your child more specifically, and then time to write that plan and to implement it into the school system. So all of this takes quite a bit of time, and we'll look at those time frames here in a few slides, but it's really geared towards individualizing. So this all just takes time in order to get the necessary steps and to get it right for your child. IEPs have specific goals for your child, and they'll be monitored with a progress report. They're provided by specialized intervention specialist. And so you will be linked to someone on your child's team that is licensed to be an intervention specialist and/or therapists that are also involved. This is a federal law, so this begins at age 3 and goes until your child's 12th grade year. Valerie will speak to you a little bit more about what can occur after that 12th grade year. In order for your child to qualify, they have to meet criteria for one of the 13 categories. So we will address this in the coming slides as well. And another point that I just wanted to bring up about IEPs, if you have a child that's in the adolescent years, they will start addressing and looking at thoughts at age 13 on transition planning. And what will this look like for your child after the 12th grade? Or really just what are your goals for your child in the coming years? So that's a piece that'll start getting introduced around age 13 of your child, and we'll start implementing plans at age 14 for your child on their IEP. So educational plan, the categories of disabilities. We have the full list here that I won't go into great detail about each of these, but what I do always like to mention, and advice that I give to families and schools that I work with in my role, is when we get to this point, we're really trying to nail down what category most identifies your child, is to really think about what accurately identifies your child's concerns and reasons for their educational implications. What tells their story the best? So as an intervention specialist, if I were to pick up your child's IEP plan, a year or so down the road, or your child switches school, which of these options really most identifies with your child's needs? And if you're looking at this thinking, well, there's quite a few on here that might identify my child's needs, then you would look at something like the multiple disabilities. And that would also give a little bit more specifics in the writing of the IEP of what that involves. Regardless, though, of what category is chosen, this does not change the services of what your child needs. That will be based on the evaluation that they do. So this, again, is just giving them a category, but doesn't dictate what your child will receive or not receive. Another decision that's made in this process of planning for your child's individual instruction is the least restrictive environment. And so the least restrictive environment refers to the environment where your child will receive their services. And at most cases, and working and figuring out where your child should receive these services, the school wants to provide it in that least restrictive environment where they are with most typical peers as possible, to the greatest extent possible. But we know that some of these services and your child's needs are not fit for just the general education classroom that's at the bottom here of our triangle. So as you begin to work your way up this triangle, you see that it becomes more restrictive. And at the very top, in very small cases, that your child would have a hospitalization type of setting. But again, most cases will fall probably somewhere in the middle here, or a mixture of some of the different environments that your child could receive their services. And when you're thinking about these services, another great point to think about is, what is your goal for your child? So, are you wanting as much normalcy as possible? And are your academic concerns not as great as just having your child included? So weighing out all those decisions as you talk with your team about what environment is the best. So kind of pulling this together now to say, okay, well, I know all these ideas about the IEP, and for some of you, again, we're not sure where everyone is in this process. So we did want to hit on this, that going back to that extensiveness of this process. So it begins with, if you're just starting to explore this with your child's school team, it would begin with a written request that you feel your child has a need for this individualized instruction. And so you would submit this writing. You could submit it to the principal, the assistant principal at your child's school, a school psychologist, an office. Some schools might have the Office of Special Education or Student Service Department. So those are all places to start to give your request that you would want your child evaluated. Once the school receives that evaluation in writing that you want your child evaluated, they have 30 days then to respond and to determine what the next steps would be. And really important to note, parents are involved in this process. So when the team does determine whether or not they're going to evaluate, you have a say in that. And you have a place to share what it is your concerns are and why you are asking for this. After the school meets and determines yes or no, but if they determine yes, that we are going to evaluate, the school then has 60 days to complete the evaluation. Now, they can do it in a sooner timeline than that, but that is the maximum amount that they have to complete the evaluation. From there, the team will meet again to bring all of those evaluation pieces together. And this is where it's really helpful if your child is connected to maybe a pediatric hospital, or you have some private therapists that can provide some input as well into this evaluation. So if your child works with a private speech or occupational therapist, they can really give some good insight too into what they think would be helpful in the school setting. All of this is just a piece of the process. So you just want to think about gathering all of these puzzle pieces, bringing it together to this evaluation meeting. And then at that meeting is where you really get into the rich discussion of what your child needs and what would be appropriate for school. At that point is when the team will say, do we suspect a disability? And if so, which category? And you start making those decisions. They then have, and again, here's this timeline, but they then have 30 days to implement and to write the IEP. So each step of this process, again, you will meet as a team. And typically once you get to this point in the process, you're going to involve multiple people. So you're going to have a general education teacher. You're going to have a special intervention specialist. You're going to have different therapists involved, the school psychologist, all of these people, again, this big puzzle that we're bringing together to make sure your child's needs are met. And sometimes as school liaisons, Valerie and I will participate in certain steps along the way to help promote and provide communication regarding the child's needs from a medical perspective. So if you are tied again to a pediatric hospital or to other institutions that could provide some of that input, always helpful to have. So now looking at those different systems in place. So what we've been talking about generally through this presentation has been the public school system, those guidelines, those standards that are held to the federal guidelines and are tied to the public schools. But we also have charter schools. Charter schools can be a public or a non-public charter school. So again, you'll want to possibly look on your state's website to figure out what charter schools are available in your area and whether or not they're public or non-public. There's also the online school option. These are popping up more and more these days. And we just caution as you're making this type of decision to really think about your child's needs and how they will best be served by getting any related services like OT, PT, speech. How would that look from the online option? Thinking about what type of online option is available. Is it asynchronous where they are just going through a system or a program? Or is it more synchronous where they're going to be attached to a teacher who will be directing them step by step? Because as Valerie alluded to earlier, we have these pieces of executive functioning deficits that sometimes can be really difficult to navigate in an online school system if it is not a synchronous learning system. Then we have the private schools, and they can offer something similar to IEPs if the resources are available. They're often called the individual service plan or accommodation plans that they can implement. But again, going back to that administrator to find out what is it that this private school is able to offer for your child. Sometimes those smaller private schools can offer just as much and just what your child needs. And it's helpful that they're in a smaller environment, but sometimes the public school or some of the other options are a better fit just because they might have more resources. Finally, we have the option of homeschooling, not the same as home instruction through your child's public school district, but really assuming the responsibilities as the parent to be your child's educators. And in some instances, you may have to have some out-of-pocket costs for the home instruction or tutoring. And there are creative ways, though, to bring in therapists, occupational therapists into that environment as well. So a lot of decisions to be made, a lot of options out there. Most helpful, again, to probably go to your state website to figure out what is in your area to offer. So now here we are at another rest stop. Again, we want to take this time to give you a moment to reflect on what we've talked about in this section. You know, what type of plan does your child have, or are you thinking about for your child? If they already have a plan, are there barriers that you've encountered that perhaps we can help you problem solve at the end of this presentation with questions? Or what concerns do you have regarding your child's current plans, or any other questions that you may have thought of? So we'll pause here for a minute and give you a minute to jot some things down.
Okay, so all these ideas sound great, but the reality is in your 13 plus years for schooling for your child, at some point, you're going to disagree with the school team. So what do you do in those situations? You know your child best, you love your child, you're going to advocate for your child, but it can be hard if you're in a small school district where everyone knows everybody. You certainly don't want to burn bridges. It can be difficult if you're in a large school district and you feel like you're hitting red tape and dealing with a lot of bureaucracy. So that's why you have to really stay focused and work together for whatever your child needs. So how do you come together to do what's in the best interest of your child? So we're going to go over a few of those things to do, disagreements, and a couple others as we wrap up our presentation. So really the first thing is just to speak up and ask questions. If you don't agree with something, simply ask. If you think your child needs an increase in minutes, or you found, a new teaching strategy, or you thought of something you wanted, a new goal, just ask. Sometimes either you'll understand why the teacher wasn't doing it that way or why the team wasn't, or they may say, oh, okay, great, sure, no problem, and add it in. You also can work through the district, basically the district hierarchy. Depends again how large your district is, but generally you're going to want to start with the teacher or the individual therapist, providing, whatever it is that you are wanting to see changed. Then you can go to a building assistant principal or principal. You could then look at if there's a special education supervisor or coordinator. In some districts, there's only a director, but then go to the director. If needed, you can talk to the superintendent. So work your way through that chain before you kind of jump to the top. Another idea, and this is where you really need to know your rights, is an independent education evaluation. You should get at every IEP meeting something called, I think at least in Ohio, it's called Whose Idea Is It? And it goes through a parent's rights for a child with a disability. An independent education evaluation is anytime you don't agree with a school's evaluation, you have the right to request at public expense an evaluation from a private outside person who's qualified to do such an evaluation. So if it's speech, if it's an OT evaluation, if it's a psychological evaluation or IQ testing, if it is something with vision, if it's something with even behavior, you can again request an evaluation from an outside person outside of the school district. Another idea, and this is probably one of my favorites, would be a temporary compromise. So let's say you and school are not seeing eye to eye with something. So pick a short time period to try whatever it is that you're discussing. So maybe it's a change in placement. Now this is a little, with paperwork, it can be a little tricky and cumbersome for the school, but let's say, you know, you aren't sure you really want to try something, maybe do it for 4 to 6 weeks. 6 weeks tends to be that holy grail for time periods in the school district. So go ahead and then meet back and decide, look at some data. Was that helpful? Was it not helpful? Same goes for, you know, if you really want to try something school doesn't, ask them to try it for a short period of time and then reevaluate. There's also something called IEP facilitation or facilitated IEP meeting. These vary, not all states have these, but Ohio, for instance, does. You can call the district or department, Department of Education and request where a third party and neutral party would simply attend the IEP meeting. And this is if your meetings are getting a little contentious and heated, having that third party can sometimes help just by having that presence there, keep things calm and focused. You can also go to mediation, where again, a third party would help negotiate an agreement between you and the school. And then there's also due process. If you're getting to the point of due process, there's probably some pretty egregious or significant concerns. Sometimes schools will do a resolution meeting as soon as the complaint is made, so they can try to resolve things and not go any further than that. You can do a written complaint that will result in a hearing usually. And really all of these things should come at no cost to you unless you choose to hire an attorney. All of the other legal proceedings, things like that will be covered by the public school district. And then if you're again at a crossroads, you do have options for your child. So one would be alternative schools. There could be private schools that may be a better fit for your child, maybe because of being able to provide a more individualized or services or a smaller environment that might be better for your child. There are charter schools. In Ohio, we have a lot of public charter schools. Sometimes there's a few of them that specialize in certain areas. And then you have specialized schools. I know at least in Kentucky, for us here across the river, there are some that focus on kids with complex medical needs. Sometimes you can choose some of those options, especially the first two. The third one, sometimes school will actually place. If you think about that triangle, we're talking more towards the top, but if your child needs that kind of care or support, then school may have to place them somewhere else. Some districts offer open enrollment, meaning you don't have to go to the neighborhood school, you can go to a nearby school. There are also vouchers and scholarships. Again, in Ohio, we have the John Peterson Scholarship, which is for kids on IEPs. We also have what we call Ed Choice. If the child is in a low performing school, they may have some options to look at other schools as well that would help pay for those other options. And then Lenora mentioned homeschooling. There are not only parent cooperatives where you can get to other parents and help trade off some of those responsibilities. There are also co-ops where you can pay essentially a small tuition. So not quite like a private school, a little less formal than that, but basically pay some people who might have some expertise to help with the homeschooling, to help teach your child. And then I know we're starting to get limited on time here. I want to give us time to ask questions at the end. But if you, again, are at that crossroad and you're struggling, you have options for support in the school district or in the school setting. So the first would be parent mentors and support groups. Some districts have a district employee who is generally a parent of a child with a disability, themselves, and they can help navigate the process with you. They can be somebody to call with questions, somebody to lean on. And although they are employees, I have seen some disagree with the school team and agree with what a parent is requesting for their child. So don't be afraid to work with them just because they happen to be employed by the district. Some of them are very staunch advocates for students. There are also disease-specific support groups. I don't know that the NBIA group has anybody in that position, but if your child has epilepsy, the National Epilepsy Alliance has some advocacy there as well. And then you have each other to lean on too. Keep in mind, if you're talking to somebody who's across the country, they may have a very different setting, different school district, different roles, but you obviously use each other. There's also county and state agencies, the Department of Education in your state. There may be regional educational cooperatives, or again, in Ohio, it's county service centers. They may have some additional supports in place or to put in place. Your hospital, I'm sure a lot of you travel to some kind of large pediatric institution. There would be social workers are sometimes skilled in that advocacy piece. Large hospitals like Cincinnati Children's will have folks like Lenora and me that do this kind of work. Some of them are more focused in specific areas of the hospital, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And then really nurse care managers can help facilitate documentation. Your physician can help write letters of recommendation. The private therapists, as we spoke of, can write letters of support. And sometimes we'll attend an IEP meeting too. And then if you're really, again, dealing with something truly egregious or really struggling, you can certainly seek out an advocate or an attorney, depending on your financial status. Legal aid is an option for some. It is free. There are educational advocates. Some of those could be free. Some of them may be hired. And there's education attorneys, again, that you would have to hire as well. And I really would just make sure if you are at that step that you do know that really does burn bridges and can make that relationship really tense with school if you're bringing those people in, but not necessarily. Sometimes it just is nice to have the expertise of someone like that as well. And then the last thing really is what happens after school. So the journey isn't over. There are several options. Vocational programs may be appropriate, maybe a community college, maybe a trade school. And as Lenora said, when we're looking at that transition plan, part of the IEP, this would be part of that discussion. What does the future look like for your child? And maybe vocational programming is appropriate in high school. If your child you think is appropriate for college, I would definitely look into there's Office of Accessibility Services or Office of Disability Services within that college or university. They can tell you what kind of supports they offer. Some schools are really good at offering supports for physical disabilities. Some have supports for kids with learning disabilities. So do your homework and ask a lot of questions to find out. Your state should have some kind of vocational rehabilitation program. In ours, in Ohio, it's the Bureau of Vocational Rehab. Some are agencies, some are office of, but look for that term vocational rehab within your state. And that again will help with job training, job support to get accommodations in the workplace. Your local Department of Developmental Disabilities, again, office, department, agency, could be different things, but there should be some community supports within that. And the last one up here at the top is deferred graduation. If you have a child with pretty significant disabilities, you may talk with your school about deferring graduation until the year that they turn 22. And that can give extra time for them to have support, therapies, things like that before you transition out. And sometimes I've seen this used in kids who maybe are doing vocational programming. So maybe they do traditional 4 years of high school and then they move to a vocational program, but they still remain a student in the school and the school would then pay for it. So you can explore that option as well. And as we finish up this last slide, we just wanted to put in here, we know this is a very, having a child with a disability, especially significant and as rare as what your child is dealing with, you need to really make sure you focus on self-care. I do know from looking at the schedule, we saw that there is, I think the presentation was on self-care, presentation on advocacy, some yoga that maybe I should have checked out. But we wanted to just, again, employ that self-care when you're dealing with education too. It can be exhausting. And we copied and put this diagram in here written by a woman for her son, Gabe, who has some chronic medical conditions. And you can see the number of people and areas she has to work with for her child. School is up there in the corner in red. So school is only a piece of what you're dealing with. So make sure that you're, working on staying, taking some time for yourself to work on relaxation. If you're getting ready to go into a tense meeting, take some deep breaths, focus on what's important, use others for support. At an IEP meeting, it is your right to bring along anyone you like. And if that is your best friend, who's just going to be a good moral support for you, who can help take notes, you may certainly use that as a support person as well. And then really staying grounded. I think I've seen and heard of families that will bring a picture of their child if the child's not present in the IEP meeting to keep everybody focused that we're not talking about a piece of paper. We are talking about a child with feelings, with a family, with people who love them, to help you just, again, keep focused. So remember to support yourself and lean on others as you go through this long journey with your child. And that brings us to our final rest stop. So maybe think through some difficult situation you faced. Maybe think about some people you could contact for outside support. And then jot down any further questions. We're gonna, I think, wrap up. We have one more slide here with just some resources. So these are different resources really that we go to. Lenora said, we attend meetings, we help families navigate difficult school situations for our jobs. So these are some of our favorite websites that might be helpful to you as well. And then that being said, I think we're gonna close it out here, and then we are going to be available hopefully to see some faces and to answer any questions you have. If there's anything you'd like to consult with us. If you're from another country and your system is different, but you'd like to seek some ideas from us, we are certainly welcome to do that as well. So hopefully we will see you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was an incredible session with so much really good information. I've been on this journey for 8 years and I still walked away with some really good tools and techniques. So thank you for that. For those in this session, we don't have time for Q&A right now, but you can walk over. We're not physically together. You can type over to the conference main page, and there's a link for the lounge. In the lounge, there's a link that says join the session. You can jump in and our speakers will be there to answer some more questions that you might have. So thank you so much.